In the winter of 1867, when the tree stood naked against the gray Ohio sky, the small town of Millbrook harbored a secret that few dared to speak of. Even now, as I commit these words to paper, I hesitate to recount the events that transpired in that remote corner of Knox County. The memories haunt me still, visiting my dreams with disturbing regularity, despite the passage of decades and my earnest attempts to forget. My name is Dr. Thomas Blackwood, and I was the physician who attended to young Eleanor Caldwell during her final days of lucidity. I had come to Millbrook in the autumn of 1860, seeking the quiet simplicity of rural practice after the frenetic pace of Boston's medical wards. The war between the states had just begun to cast its long shadow across our divided nation. But here in this pastoral setting, life continued at its measured pace, seemingly untouched by the greater conflicts that raged elsewhere. Millbrook itself was unremarkable. A collection of wooden structures and brick buildings arranged around a modest town square with a white steepled church at its center. The surrounding countryside was a patchwork of farms and woodlands, crisscrossed by rutted dirt roads that turned to mud in spring and became nearly impassable during winter snows. Yet there was a certain charm to the place, an innocence that I would later come to see as tragically vulnerable to forces beyond our comprehension. The Caldwell family had settled in Millbrook some 10 years prior to the events I am about to describe, having immigrated from Boston, where Mr. James Caldwell had established himself as a moderately successful merchant. They arrived in the spring of 1857, part of the westward migration that had been transforming Ohio since before I was born. Mr. Caldwell purchased attractive land on the outskirts of town and commissioned the construction of what would become one of Millbrook's finest residencies. Mrs. Catherine Caldwell was herself an educated woman, unusual for the time, having been raised in a household that valued intellectual pursuits regardless of gender. She had attended one of Boston's progressive female seminaries and possessed a library of books that was the envy of many in our small community. Slender and fair-haired with delicate features that spoke of her New England ancestry, Catherine carried herself with a quiet dignity that earned the respect, if not always the understanding, of her neighbors. Their homestead sat on the outskirts of town. A handsome two-story structure of red brick with white trim set back from the main road and partially obscured by a copse of oak trees. A wrought iron fence enclosed a garden that in summer months bloomed with a variety of flowers both native to Ohio and imported from eastern nurseries. It was a house built with prosperity in mind, with tall windows to admit the light and a broad front porch where the family might sit on warm evenings listening to the chorus of cicadas and watching fireflies rise from the surrounding fields. It was in the spring of 1855, 2 years before their arrival in Millbrook, that Eleanor was born, their only child after years of Catherine's disappointments. I learned later that there had been several miscarriages, each taking its toll on Catherine's physical strength and emotional resilience. Eleanor's safe arrival was considered nothing short of miraculous by her parents, and perhaps this contributed to the unusual attention they lavished upon her development. From the beginning, there was something remarkable about the girl. My first encounter with Eleanor came when she was barely 2 years old, when I was called to the Caldwell home to treat a minor fever. Even then, I noted an unusual alertness in her gaze, a focused intensity that seemed at odds with her tender age. She observed my examination of her with a solemn curiosity, tracking my movements with eyes that reminded me of deep mountain lakes, blue, clear, and somehow fathomless. By the age of 3, when most children are still struggling with rudimentary speech, Eleanor was speaking in full, complex sentences. Her vocabulary was extraordinary. Her pronunciation impeccable. She did not engage in the usual babbling or experimentation with sounds that characterizes early childhood language acquisition. Instead, she seemed to listen intently to adult conversation, absorbing words and grammatical structures, only to reproduce them with uncanny precision when she chose to speak. She speaks as though she were a grown woman trapped in a child's form, Catherine once confided to me during one of my regular visits to treat her chronic bronchial condition. We were seated in the Caldwell's parlor, a well-appointed room with brocade curtains and furniture imported from Cincinnati. Eleanor sat at a small desk in the corner, her dark curls falling forward as she bent over a book of illustrated nursery rhymes. Just yesterday, Catherine continued in a hushed voice, she asked me why the moon appears to follow us when we walk at night. When I explained about perspective and distance, she nodded and said, "So, it's an illusion created by our limited perception." Those were her exact words, Doctor. What child of 3 speaks of illusions and perception? I glanced at Eleanor, who seemed absorbed in her book, though I had the distinct impression she was listening to every word we exchanged. She's clearly gifted, I replied, keeping my voice equally low. Some children do develop language skills far in advance of their peers. It's uncommon, certainly, but not unprecedented in the medical literature. Catherine twisted her handkerchief between slender fingers. It's not just the words, Doctor. It's the way she watches, the way she listens. Sometimes I feel she's waiting for something, though I couldn't tell you what. Mr. Caldwell, a stern man with little patience for what he deemed women's fancies, dismissed his wife's observations as maternal pride. He was a practical individual, solidly built with a square jaw and hands that, despite his mercantile profession, were rough and calloused like a laborus. I had treated him on several occasions for gout, finding him to be a stoic patient with little tolerance for what he called medical fussing. Yet even he could not deny Eleanor's unusual abilities when, at the age of 5, the child began to speak French with the visiting pastor who had spent several years as a missionary in Quebec. It was during a Sunday afternoon gathering at the Caldwell home, one of the social occasions that Catherine organized periodically in an effort to integrate the family more fully into Millbrook society. I was present, having been invited along with several other prominent townspeople. Reverend Phillips, a gaunt man with a shock of white hair despite his relative youth, had been engaged in conversation with Catherine about his missionary work among the French-speaking populations of Canada. Eleanor, who had been quietly arranging a collection of painted wooden blocks in the corner, suddenly approached the pair. "Bonjour," she said clearly, her accent flawless to my untrained ear. The room fell silent. Reverend Phillips stared at the child in astonishment before responding in French. Eleanor answered him, and they conversed briefly in the foreign tongue while the assembled guests looked on in amazement. "Where did she learn this?" Mr. Caldwell demanded of his wife when the Reverend had switched back to English, his expression a mixture of pride and confusion. He crossed the parlor in 3 long strides, coming to stand over his daughter with hands planted firmly on his hips. Catherine could only shake her head in bewilderment, her complexion pale against the dark blue of her dress. "I've read to her from my French books," she admitted, addressing both her husband and the now curious gathering of neighbors, "but I never taught her to speak it. I myself can only read the language, not converse in it." Reverend Phillips knelt beside Eleanor, who had returned to her blocks as though nothing unusual had occurred. "The child speaks with a Quebec accent," he said wonderingly. "Not Parisian French, but the dialect I encountered in the villages outside Montreal, and she asked me specifically about my time there, as though she knew." Catherine's hand fluttered to her throat. "How could she know?" "We've never discussed the specific location of your missionary work in her presence." The Reverend had no answer, merely patting Eleanor's head with a bemused expression before rising to his feet. The party continued, but with a subdued quality, the guests stealing glances at the quiet child in the corner, who had suddenly become an object of fascination and in some cases unease. This was merely the beginning of Eleanor's linguistic journey. Within months of the incident with Reverend Phillips, she had added rudimentary German to her repertoire, apparently gleaned from conversations overheard at Mr. Schmidt's bakery, where Catherine purchased bread twice weekly. By her 7th birthday, Eleanor had expanded her linguistic abilities to include Italian and Spanish as well. She acquired these languages with an ease that defied explanation, often after only brief exposures through books or chance encounters with foreign travelers passing through Millbrook on their way west. Ohio in those days was a crossroads of sorts, with immigrants from across Europe settling in its fertile valleys or passing through on their journey to the territories beyond the Mississippi. Millbrook, though small, saw its share of these travelers, particularly after the completion of the regional railway spur in 1862. I recall an afternoon in the summer of 1863 when I encountered Eleanor and her mother in the general store. A group of Italian laborers hired to work on expanding the rail line were purchasing supplies. They conversed among themselves in rapid Italian, laughing and gesturing expansively. Eleanor, then 8 years old, stood watching them with rapt attention, her head slightly tilted as though to better capture their words. One of the men, noticing her interest, smiled and addressed her in English, heavily accented with his native tongue. "You like to hear us talk, little one?" To his evident surprise and mine, Eleanor responded in Italian. Her pronunciation was not as polished as it would later become, but the men's reactions made it clear that she was entirely comprehensible. A brief conversation ensued during which Eleanor explained that she was learning their language from a book of Italian poetry her mother had given her. "But how do you know how to say the words?" one of the workers asked in broken English, clearly baffled. "The sounds? They are not like English." Eleanor considered this for a moment, her small brow furrowed in thought. "I hear them in my head," she finally replied in English. "When I read the words, I hear how they should sound." The Italian workers exchanged glances. Then one of them made the sign of the cross over his chest. They soon made their excuses and departed, leaving Catherine standing uncomfortably amidst the curious stares of the other shoppers. It was incidents like these that began to set the Caldwells apart in Millbrook society. The townspeople regarded Eleanor with a mixture of awe and unease. In those days, extraordinary abilities in children were often viewed with suspicion. The shadow of Salem still lingered in the American consciousness, particularly in communities with strong Protestant traditions. Millbrook, with its white-steepled church and regular revival meetings, was no exception. Some whispered that the girl's gift was unnatural, perhaps even the work of dark forces. Mrs. Abernathy, the blacksmith's wife and a woman known for her religious fervor, once suggested within my hearing that the child should be brought before the church elders to determine whether her abilities were godly or otherwise. Others, particularly the more educated citizens like myself and Judge Harmon, spoke of prodigies we had read about in scientific journals and newspapers from the East. I myself was fascinated by Eleanor's abilities from a scientific perspective. Having completed my medical training at Harvard Medical School before settling in the relative quiet of rural Ohio, I had read accounts of similar cases in the medical literature. There were documented instances of children with extraordinary memories, mathematical abilities, or artistic talents that seemed to transcend their years and education. However, none that I had encountered seemed to match the scope of Eleanor's linguistic talents. During my visits to the Caldwell home, ostensibly to monitor Catherine's respiratory condition, I took the opportunity to observe Eleanor whenever possible. I kept notes in a separate journal, documenting her progress and attempting to discern patterns in her language acquisition. She seemed to absorb languages in stages, first understanding, then speaking with a basic vocabulary, rapidly progressing to more complex expressions, and finally achieving a fluency that native speakers found remarkable. On one such visit in the autumn of 1863, while Catherine rested upstairs following a particularly severe bout of bronchitis, I found myself alone with Eleanor in the family library. It was a well-appointed room lined with bookcases that reached the ceiling, a rolling ladder providing access to the higher shelves. A large desk occupied one corner, its surface covered with maps and ledgers from Mr. Caldwell's business. Eleanor sat in a window seat, sunlight streaming through the glass to illuminate the book in her lap. "What are you reading today, Eleanor?" I inquired, taking a seat in a leather armchair across from her. She held up the volume for my inspection. It was a collection of Greek myths, the text in the original Greek with English translations provided alongside. "I'm reading about Orpheus and Eurydice," she replied. "It's sad." "You can read the Greek?" I asked, though I should not have been surprised by this point. Eleanor nodded solemnly. "The Greek letters look strange at first, but they make patterns, and the patterns match to sounds. Once you see the patterns, it's easy. Would you read some for me? In the Greek, I mean." She turned back to the book and began to read aloud. The words were unfamiliar to me, but she pronounced them with confidence, her cadence suggesting she understood the rhythm of the language. When she finished the passage, she looked up expectantly. "That was very impressive," I told her. "How many languages can you read now, Eleanor?" She considered the question seriously. "I can read and speak English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. I can read some Latin, but it's harder to speak because I don't hear it used. And I'm learning Russian from Mr. Petrov's letters." The name was unfamiliar to me. Mr. Petrov. He writes to Father about furs and timber. Father lets me read the letters sometimes. They come from St. Petersburg. She pronounced the Russian city's name with a different accent than the rest of her sentence, presumably mimicking the way it would sound in Russian. I made a note in my small pocket journal. Do you find some languages easier to learn than others? Eleanor tilted her head, considering. They're all different, but they're all the same, too. They have different clothes, but underneath they're built the same way. She paused, searching for words to explain her insight. It's like people. They look different on the outside, but inside everyone has a heart and lungs and a brain. Languages have hearts, too. When Eleanor was 8, Mr. Caldwell's business connections brought a Chinese merchant to their home. Mr. Lin was a representative of a trading company based in San Francisco, traveling east to establish new partnerships for the import of silk, tea, and porcelain. His arrival in Millbrook caused quite a stir, as few of the townsfolk had ever seen a person of Chinese descent before. He stayed at the Caldwell residence for nearly a week, during which time I was invited to dine with them on 2 occasions. Mr. Lin was a dignified man of middle years, dressed in Western attire but with an unmistakable grace that spoke of his different cultural background. He spoke English well, though with a pronounced accent, and conversed intelligently on a wide range of topics, from commerce to philosophy. I found him to be excellent company, and even Mr. Caldwell, not typically known for his cosmopolitan outlook, seemed to enjoy their business discussions. To everyone's astonishment, after listening to Mr. Lin speak for less than an hour during the first dinner, Eleanor began to mimic his words. Initially, this seemed like the innocent game of a child, perhaps even bordering on impertinence. Mr. Lin, however, was not offended. On the contrary, his eyes widened in surprise, and he responded to her in his native Mandarin. Eleanor frowned in concentration, then attempted to reply. Her first efforts were clumsy, but Mr. Lin encouraged her with remarkable patience. By the end of the evening, she had mastered several simple phrases. Within 3 days, she was carrying on a halting conversation with him in his native tongue. Mr. Lin was so impressed that he presented her with a small book of Chinese characters before his departure, which Eleanor treasured. "How do you do it, Eleanor?" I asked her privately after witnessing one of these exchanges. "How do you learn so quickly?" She looked up at me with those uncannily perceptive eyes. "It is as though the words are already inside me," she explained with a child's directness. "I need only to hear them spoken aloud to remember what I already know." Her explanation sent a chill through me, though I could not have articulated why at the time. There was something in her phrasing, the notion that the languages existed within her before exposure, waiting to be awakened, that struck me as profoundly unnatural. It suggested not learning but remembering, as though Eleanor had somehow lived other lives in other lands, accruing linguistic knowledge that her young mind should have had no access to. I dismissed such fanciful thoughts as unscientific, of course. My medical training had instilled in me a commitment to rational explanation and empirical evidence. Yet, there remained something about Eleanor's abilities that resisted conventional understanding, that seemed to exist at the periphery of scientific knowledge. By her 10th birthday in the spring of 1865, Eleanor had mastered 11 languages: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Latin, Greek, Russian, Arabic, and a dialect of Iroquoian she had learned from an old native woman who sold baskets in the town square. The Iroquoian language was perhaps the most surprising addition to her repertoire, as it was structurally unlike any of the European or Asian languages she had previously acquired. The old woman, whom the townspeople called simply Indian Mary, appeared in Millbrook each spring with her handcrafted baskets and occasionally medicinal herbs that she sold to those willing to trust in native remedies. Most of the townspeople treated her with a mixture of condescension and wariness, but Catherine Caldwell had always shown her kindness, purchasing her wares and offering her tea on the back porch. It was during one of these exchanges that Eleanor first encountered the Iroquoian language. I was not present for the initial meeting, but Catherine later described how Eleanor had stood transfixed as Indian Mary spoke to another native person who had accompanied her that day. Within moments, the child had approached them and attempted to repeat the sound she had heard. Rather than taking offense, Indian Mary had seemed amused, and then increasingly astonished as Eleanor quickly began to grasp the basics of the complex language. Over the course of several spring and summer visits, Eleanor learned the Iroquoian dialect with the same facility she had shown for other languages. Indian Mary, according to Catherine, treated the child with a curious reverence. After the initial surprise wore off, she brought Eleanor small gifts, a beaded bracelet, a carved wooden animal, a pouch of special herbs, and spent hours in conversation with her when she visited Millbrook. She tells stories of the old days, Eleanor explained to me when I inquired about these interactions. Before the white men came. She says the forests were different then, fuller of life and spirits. She says some of the spirits still linger, waiting for someone who can hear their voices. I remember feeling a twinge of concern at this. The old woman was clearly filling the child's head with native superstitions, which seemed harmless enough in one sense, but which contributed to the growing perception among the townspeople that there was something otherworldly about Eleanor. Eleanor could move between these 11 languages with fluid ease, sometimes speaking in one and responding in another without seeming to notice the transition. I witnessed this phenomenon during a gathering at the Caldwell home where several of Mr. Caldwell's business associates were present. The conversation had turned to international trade, and as each man offered his perspective, Eleanor responded to them in their native tongues, French to Mr. Dupont, German to Mr. Keller, English to her father, as naturally as breathing. The men were at first charmed, then increasingly discomfited as the evening wore on and Eleanor's facility became more pronounced. "It's uncanny," Mr. Dupont commented to me in an undertone as we stood near the punch bowl. "I have studied English for 20 years and still struggle. This child speaks French as though she were born in Paris. Yet I understand she has never left Ohio." "She is certainly gifted," I replied neutrally, though I shared his sense of unease. There was something almost mechanical in the way Eleanor shifted between languages, as though she were a living translation device rather than a child engaged in the normal process of communication. Catherine kept detailed journals of her daughter's progress, which she showed me during my visits. These records began as a mother's proud documentation of her child's extraordinary development, but evolved over time into something more systematic and eventually more anxious. The pages were filled with observations, transcribed conversations, and lists of new words Eleanor had acquired. Catherine documented the date and circumstances of each new language Eleanor encountered, along with notes on how quickly she progressed from basic comprehension to fluency. There were also more personal reflections on Eleanor's changing temperament, her interactions with other children, increasingly rare as she grew older, and Catherine's own conflicted feelings about her daughter's abilities. "I am proud, of course," she wrote in an entry from early 1865 that she shared with me. "What mother would not be proud of such brilliance? Yet I find myself wondering if this gift is entirely a blessing. Eleanor has no friends her own age. The other children find her strange and avoid her in school. Even the adults in town regard her with a mixture of fascination and fear. I worry for her future. What place will the world have for a girl such as she?" It was through these journals that I first noticed the subtle changes beginning to manifest in the girl's behavior. Catherine's entries from late 1864 were largely positive, recording Eleanor's linguistic achievements and intellectual development with maternal pride. By early 1865, however, a note of concern had crept into her observations. "Eleanor seems increasingly distracted during our lessons," she wrote in February. "She stares out the window for long periods, and when I ask what she is looking at, she claims to see people walking among the trees, though the yard is empty. When pressed, she says they are not people exactly, but something else that looks almost human. And in March, Eleanor refused to enter the root cellar today. When sent to fetch potatoes for Hannah, she stood at the top of the stairs, trembling and pale, insisting that they were waiting in the darkness below. When James demanded an explanation, she could not or would not provide one. He carried her bodily down the steps to show her there was nothing to fear, but she screamed so terribly that he relented and brought her back up. She remained agitated for hours afterward. The winter of 1865 was particularly harsh in Ohio. Heavy snows isolated Millbrook for weeks at a time, and many succumbed to illness. The war was drawing to its bloody conclusion, and though Ohio had been spared the direct ravages of the conflict, its sons had fought and died on distant battlefields. A sense of exhaustion pervaded the nation, a bone-deep weariness that found expression in the somber mood of even remote communities like ours. The Caldwells, with their sturdy home and ample provisions, fared better than most during these difficult months. Eleanor, now 10, spent the long winter days reading voraciously from her father's extensive library. Mr. Caldwell had accumulated a remarkable collection of books over the years, many in the various languages that now interested his daughter. There were volumes of history, philosophy, poetry, and science, as well as religious texts from various traditions. Eleanor devoured them all with equal enthusiasm. It was during this period of intense study and relative isolation that Catherine's journals began to note concerning observations about her daughter's behavior. The first entries were tentative, as though Catherine was reluctant to commit her worries to paper, fearing that doing so would make them more real. Eleanor spoke in her sleep again last night, she wrote in January of 1866. The words were not in any language I recognize, not French or German or any of the others she has learned. The sounds were harsh, guttural, with strange rhythms unlike human speech. When I mentioned it at breakfast, she had no recollection of dreaming. A week later, found E standing at her window at 3 o'clock this morning speaking to someone in the yard. The temperature was well below freezing, yet she wore only her nightgown and showed no sign of discomfort. When I asked whom she was addressing, she pointed to a spot near the old oak tree. When I looked, there was only undisturbed snow. She claimed a woman was standing there teaching her words in a new language. I saw no footprints when I checked the yard at first light, though the strange markings I observed in the snow the next morning were too narrow for any human foot. I remember reading this entry during a visit in early February and feeling a sense of professional concern. Children of Eleanor's age often have vivid imaginations, and the combination of her unusual intellectual development and the isolation of the harsh winter might well have contributed to the development of an imaginary companion. Yet, there was something in Catherine's description, the specificity of the time, the incongruity of Eleanor's apparent comfort in the freezing temperature, the mention of strange markings in the snow, that suggested something more troubling might be occurring. Has Eleanor shown any other unusual behaviors? I asked Catherine as we sat in her parlor. Eleanor was upstairs in her room, supposedly working on her French composition, though we could hear her footsteps moving restlessly across the floor above us. Catherine hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the embroidery hoop in her lap. She has changed, Dr. Blackwood. The Eleanor I knew a year ago was an open book to me. Unusual in her abilities, yes, but still very much a child, curious, affectionate, eager to please. This Eleanor, she glanced toward the ceiling, this Eleanor has secrets. She whispers to herself when she thinks no one is listening. She draws strange symbols in the margins of her school books. And sometimes, when she doesn't know I'm watching, her face takes on an expression I don't recognize, older, harder, as though someone else is looking out through my daughter's eyes. Children of her age do begin to establish independence from their parents, I offered, though I knew this rational explanation didn't fully address Catherine's concerns. And given Eleanor's unusual intellectual development, it's not surprising that she might seem older than her years at times. It's more than that. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Last week, I found her in the library with one of James's books on ancient religions. She had opened it to a section on forgotten gods, deities worshipped by civilizations long turned to dust. When I asked what she was reading, she looked up at me with this strange smile and said, "They're not forgotten. They're just waiting." As Eleanor's 11th birthday approached in the spring of 1866, these episodes increased in frequency. Catherine reported that her daughter would often stop mid-conversation, tilt her head as though listening to another voice, and then continue speaking in a language unknown to any of us. These weren't merely snippets of the 11 languages we knew she had mastered. This was something entirely different, a tongue with harsh consonants and peculiar vowel sounds that seemed to vibrate in the air long after she had fallen silent. When questioned, Eleanor would appear confused, claiming she had been speaking English all along. Her bewilderment seemed genuine. There was no sign of deception in her manner, only a momentary disorientation followed by a return to her normal demeanor. It was as though she experienced brief fugue states during which another personality, or something altogether different, took control of her speech. Mr. Caldwell, ever practical, attributed these incidents to an overactive imagination and too many ghost stories before bedtime. "The girl reads too much," he declared when Catherine expressed her concerns during one of my visits. "All those foreign books filling her head with fanciful notions. What she needs is fresh air and the company of other children, not more time with dusty tomes in languages no one here can understand. There was some wisdom in his perspective. Eleanor's isolation, partly due to her extraordinary abilities setting her apart from her peers, and partly due to the Caldwell's somewhat removed position in Millbrook society, had certainly intensified during the past year. The few friendships she had managed to form in her early school days had withered as the other children became increasingly uncomfortable with her differences. Their discomfort had in some cases turned to active avoidance or even cruelty, the common response of children to that which they do not understand. Yet Catherine was not so easily convinced by her husband's dismissal. Her worry was evident in the increasingly desperate tone of her journal entries as the spring of 1866 progressed. Eleanor refused to sleep in her bed last night, she wrote in early April. I found her curled in the corner of her room at midnight, her eyes open but unseeing. When I tried to guide her back to bed, she became agitated, insisting that they'd sit on her chest when she lies down, making it impossible to breathe. She would not say who they are. And a week later, there is something wrong with my child. Today, she recited a poem in a language that sounded ancient and terrible, the words like stones grinding against one another. When I asked her to translate, she told me it was a summoning and that she must not say the words in English. Her eyes were strange, almost black in the dim light of the parlor. I fear what is happening to her. I fear what she is becoming. It was around this time that Mr. Caldwell, despite his initial skepticism, began to share his wife's concerns enough to seek my professional opinion. Though my specialty was physical ailments rather than diseases of the mind, I had some familiarity with the emerging field of psychiatric medicine through my correspondence with colleagues in Europe, particularly the work of early alienists in France and Germany who were attempting to bring scientific rigor to the study of mental disorders. The Caldwells invited me to dinner one evening in late April. And after the meal, Mr. Caldwell asked Eleanor to retire to her room so that the adults might speak privately. Once she had gone, reluctantly, I noted, with backward glances that suggested she knew she was the subject of our impending discussion, Mr. Caldwell outlined his concerns with a direct manner typical of his character. Something is wrong with the girl, he stated bluntly, pouring himself a generous glass of brandy from a crystal decanter. Catherine has been telling me for months, and I've been a fool not to listen sooner. Now I've seen it for myself, and I can no longer deny that Eleanor needs help. What have you observed specifically? I asked, accepting a smaller measure of the spirit from my host. Catherine sat silently beside the fireplace, her face partially in shadow, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Caldwell took a long swallow of his brandy before responding. 3 nights ago, I was awakened by Catherine's scream. I found her in Eleanor's room, backed against the wall, while Eleanor stood on her bed, speaking in that language Catherine has mentioned. But it wasn't just the strange words, doctor. It was her voice, deep, resonant, impossible for a child of her size, and her eyes. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to relate. Her eyes were wrong. The pupils were so dilated that no color showed at all. When I approached the bed, she turned to look at me, and I swear to you, it was not my daughter looking back at me. What did you do? I prompted when he fell silent. I called her name loudly, repeatedly. It seemed to take an eternity, but eventually she blinked and her eyes returned to normal. She looked confused, frightened. She had no memory of standing on the bed or speaking in the strange tongue. She began to cry, and I held her until she fell asleep again. He drained his glass. It was nearly dawn before Catherine and I could bring ourselves to leave her room. Neither of us slept again that night. I turned to Catherine. And you've witnessed similar episodes? She nodded, her face pale in the firelight. With increasing frequency. And there are other things, small oddities that might mean nothing individually, but taken together. She trailed off, then visibly gathered her courage to continue. Objects in her room move. I've seen it myself. Books sliding across her desk when no one is near them. Her hairbrush falling to the floor when it was placed well back from the edge. The temperature in her room drops suddenly, even when the fire is well stoked. And the birds, she stopped abruptly. The birds? I echoed. They die, she whispered. Whenever Eleanor becomes particularly agitated, we find dead birds on the windowsill of her room the next morning. No marks on them, no evident cause, just dead, their eyes open, staring at nothing. I made notes in my small journal, trying to maintain a clinical detachment despite the chill that had settled at the base of my spine. The phenomena they described went well beyond what could be explained by typical childhood behavioral issues or even the more serious mental disturbances I had studied. Yet my medical training compelled me to seek rational explanations where possible. Has Eleanor complained of headaches? Periods of disorientation or confusion aside from these episodes? Any physical symptoms at all? Both parents shook their heads. She is in perfect physical health, Catherine confirmed. Her appetite is normal. She sleeps soundly between incidents, and she has continued to excel in her studies. It's only these periodic episodes and the gradual changes in her personality that concern us. Changes in personality? I prompted. She's withdrawn, Mr. Caldwell said. The Eleanor of a year ago was bright, talkative, engaged with everything around her. This Eleanor spends hours alone in her room speaking to herself or to someone we cannot see. She shows little interest in activities that once delighted her, and she's developed a certain coldness, an emotional distance that is unsettling in one so young. I closed my notebook and considered my next words carefully. I would like to examine Eleanor, if I may. A formal assessment might help determine the nature of what's occurring. The Caldwells exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years of marriage. Of course, Catherine said after a moment. Whatever you think best, Doctor. My first formal examination of Eleanor took place the following morning in the sunlit conservatory at the rear of the Caldwell home. It was a pleasant space filled with potted plants and comfortable wicker furniture, with large windows that overlooked the garden. I had chosen it deliberately for its cheerful atmosphere, hoping to put Eleanor at ease. She was a slender child with pale skin and dark hair that fell in thick waves past her shoulders. She wore a simple blue dress with white trim, her only adornment a small silver locket that had been a gift from her father on her 10th birthday. Her eyes, a penetrating blue that reminded me of the deep waters of Lake Erie, seemed too knowing for a child of her years. There was a gravity to her gaze, a watchfulness that made me feel I was being assessed even as I prepared to evaluate her. She greeted me politely in English, then switched to German, which she knew I had studied during my time at Harvard. Mother says you're concerned about me, she said in that language, her accent flawless. She thinks I'm becoming strange. I'm interested in understanding you better, I replied in the same tongue, though my German was far less fluent than hers. Your parents have noticed some changes in your behavior that worry them. Eleanor shrugged, a gesture too adult for her small frame. People fear what they don't understand. They always have. She said this in English, and there was a weariness in her tone that was deeply incongruous coming from an 11-year-old. I began with standard physical examinations, checking her pulse, reflexes, pupillary response, and other basic indicators of health. As her parents had reported, I found her to be in excellent physical condition. Her heart rate was steady, her breathing normal, her skin neither too warm nor too cool to suggest fever or circulatory issues. As I worked, I engaged her in conversation, asking about her studies, her interests, and her friendships. Her responses were articulate and thoughtful, if somewhat reserved. She spoke of her languages as one might speak of old friends, each with its own personality and character. She had few companions her own age, she admitted, but claimed not to miss what she had never really had. The other children find me peculiar, she said matter-of-factly. They don't like it when I use words they don't know or when I speak in languages they can't understand. At first they called me names. Now they mostly pretend I don't exist. That must be difficult for you, I suggested. Another of those two adult shrugs. I have my books and my languages. And the others? I felt a flicker of alertness at this. The others? Who do you mean, Eleanor? For the first time, she seemed to withdraw slightly, her gaze sliding away from mine to fix on a point beyond my shoulder. Just friends. People I talk to sometimes. People your parents can't see. She hesitated, then nodded once, a quick dip of her chin. They don't show themselves to everyone. Only to those who can understand them. And you can understand them. What do they say to you? Eleanor's face took on a closed expression. I don't want to talk about them anymore. Can we go back to the language questions? I like those better. I made a note in my book, but didn't press the issue, not wanting to cause her to shut down completely. Instead, I shifted to questions about her recent episodes, the sleepwalking, the strange language her mother had reported, the periods where she seemed to be someone else. I found her to be alert and intelligent with no obvious signs of mental disturbance during our conversation. Her pulse was regular, her reflexes normal. When I inquired about the episodes her mother had described, she seemed genuinely perplexed. Mother worries too much, she said, reverting to English. I sometimes hear the languages in my dreams, that's all. They want to be spoken aloud. They? I asked, my pencil poised above my notebook. The phrasing echoed what she had said years earlier about languages being already inside her, waiting to be remembered. A shadow passed over her face, a momentary darkening like a cloud crossing the sun. The words, she clarified, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't the full truth. The languages. They're alive in a way. Don't you think? They have their own spirits. I noted her response without comment, though I found the personification curious. Children often attribute living qualities to inanimate concepts, but there was something in Eleanor's tone that suggested she meant this literally. Do you ever find yourself speaking or writing in a language that isn't one of the 11 you've learned? I asked, keeping my voice casual as I checked her ears with my otoscope. Eleanor went very still. What do you mean? Your mother mentioned hearing you speak in a language she didn't recognize, not French or German or any of the others she knows you've studied. Do you remember doing that? She was silent for so long that I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes there are words in my head that don't belong to any of my languages. They're older. They want to be said aloud, but I try not to. They're not for everyone to hear. Why not? I asked gently. Because they change things, she replied, and would say no more on the subject. Over the next several months, I visited the Caldwell home regularly, sometimes in my official capacity as family physician, sometimes under the guise of social calls. Catherine's journals provided a detailed account of Eleanor's continuing strange behavior, while my own observations remained frustratingly inconclusive. The girl was clearly unusual, but whether her condition represented a medical concern or merely an extraordinary intellect paired with childish fancy, I could not determine. In my notes from that period, I find records of normal days interspersed with accounts of troubling incidents, Eleanor reading peacefully in the garden one afternoon, conversing intelligently about botanical classifications, Eleanor found speaking to empty air in the cellar the next day, her voice distorted and her eyes vacant, Eleanor playing a simple tune on the pianoforte, her small fingers moving with surprising dexterity, Eleanor discovered in the middle of the night standing atop the dining table, chanting in the unknown language while objects in the room trembled and rattled against their surfaces. These episodes seemed to come in waves, with periods of relative normalcy followed by days or weeks of escalating strangeness. I began to chart them against other factors, the weather, the lunar cycle, Eleanor's physical health, significant events in the household, seeking patterns that might explain the fluctuations. Nothing coherent emerged from this analysis, though I noted a possible correlation with celestial events. The most severe episode seemed to coincide with meteor showers or unusual astronomical occurrences, though this observation was based on too few data points to be considered significant. In September of 1866, shortly after Eleanor's 11th birthday, an incident occurred that would mark the beginning of her rapid decline. Mr. Caldwell had arranged for a daguerreotype portrait of the family, a relatively expensive undertaking that required the services of a photographer from Columbus. The session took place in the Caldwell parlor on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor, dressed in her finest blue dress with white lace collar, sat between her parents on a velvet settee. According to Catherine's account, Eleanor remained perfectly still during the long exposure as instructed by the photographer. When the plate was developed, however, everyone was shocked by the result. While Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell appeared normally, Eleanor's face was distorted, her features blurred as though she had moved despite all witnesses agreeing she had remained motionless. More disturbing was what appeared to be a second figure in the image, a shadowy presence standing behind Eleanor, its face obscured but its hand clearly visible on the girl's shoulder. The photographer, a Mr. Simmons with 20 years' experience in his craft, could offer no explanation for the anomaly. "I've never seen anything like it," he told the family, his hands trembling slightly as he packed away his equipment. Perhaps there was a flaw in the plate. He offered to take another portrait at no additional charge, but Mr. Caldwell declined. The spoiled daguerreotype was stored away in a drawer, though Catherine confessed to me that she sometimes took it out when alone, studying the mysterious figure with a mixture of dread and fascination. Following this incident, Eleanor's behavior changed dramatically. She became withdrawn, spending hours alone in her room. Her previously voracious appetite for books diminished. Most concerning to her parents, she stopped speaking altogether for days at a time. When she did speak, it was often in what Catherine described as the unknown tongue, a language that resembled none of the 11 she had previously mastered. The sounds were harsh and guttural, with rhythms that seemed to follow no natural pattern of human speech. On October 17, 1866, Catherine's journal records the first instance of what would become a recurring event. Woke the household with screams at midnight. When we reached her room, she was standing on her bed, her nightgown soaked with sweat, speaking rapidly in that terrible language. Her eyes were open but did not seem to see us. When James took her by the shoulders, she fought him with surprising strength, leaving deep scratches on his forearms. It took nearly an hour to calm her. In the morning, she remembered nothing. These night terrors increased in frequency and intensity throughout the autumn. Eleanor would be found in various parts of the house, sometimes huddled in corners, sometimes standing atop furniture, always speaking in the unknown language. On several occasions, objects in her vicinity were reported to move without being touched, books falling from shelves, chairs scraping across floors, windows opening against the wind. I prescribed various remedies common to the period: valerian root to promote restful sleep, cold baths to reduce nervous excitement, a diet rich in proteins and low in stimulants. Nothing seemed to have any effect. If anything, Eleanor's condition worsened with each passing week. By December, Catherine was herself showing signs of severe strain. Her cough had returned with greater force, and she had lost considerable weight. Mr. Caldwell, a man unaccustomed to situations beyond his control, vacillated between anger and despair. "Fix her," he demanded during one of my visits, his voice breaking. "Whatever the cost, whatever must be done, return my daughter to me." I wish I could have offered him more hope, but the truth was that medical science in 1866 had little to offer in cases like Eleanor's. The asylums were filled with patients suffering from similar symptoms, most of whom never recovered. I could not bring myself to suggest such a fate for this remarkable child. It was Catherine who first connected Eleanor's linguistic abilities to her deteriorating condition. It began with the languages, she told me one grey afternoon as we sat in the parlour listening to Eleanor pace in her room above us. All those words, all those voices in her mind. What if they opened something inside her? What if they let something in? I dismissed her theory as the natural inclination of a mother to find meaning in her child's suffering. Yet in the privacy of my own thoughts, I could not help but wonder. The human brain remains largely a mystery, its capabilities and vulnerabilities still largely uncharted. Could Eleanor's extraordinary facility with language have somehow predisposed her to this apparent madness? As 1866 drew to a close, a new element entered the increasingly disturbing picture. Eleanor began to make predictions, specific, detailed forecasts of events that subsequently came to pass. She foretold the collapse of the miller's barn 3 days before a freak windstorm brought the structure down. She spoke of blood in the town well hours before a dead fox was discovered floating in it. Most disturbingly, she described in vivid detail the death of old Mrs. Winters, the town sempstress, recounting the woman's final moments alone in her cottage as she succumbed to a stroke. When Mr. Winters found his mother's body the following morning, the scene matched Eleanor's description precisely. These predictions were delivered in her normal voice, in clear English, often during brief periods of lucidity between her more disturbing episodes. She seemed unaware of the impact of her words, continuing her activities as though she had made the most mundane of observations. The townspeople, already wary of the strange girl on the outskirts of Millbrook, began to actively avoid the Caldwell family. Whispers of witchcraft, always present but previously confined to the most superstitious elements of the community, grew louder. Anonymous letters appeared on the Caldwell doorstep, suggesting remedies ranging from prayer to exorcism to more sinister cures. Catherine, her health continuing to decline, withdrew from what little society remained open to her. Mr. Caldwell buried himself in his business affairs, often staying in his Columbus office for days at a time. Eleanor, increasingly isolated, turned inward in ways that became ever more concerning. She began to draw obsessively, continuously, using whatever materials were at hand. When her supply of paper was exhausted, she turned to the walls of her bedroom, covering the floral wallpaper with intricate patterns and symbols that resembled no known alphabet. When denied drawing materials, she used her fingernails to scratch the symbols into the wooden posts of her bed, the window sills, even her own arms. I first saw these drawings during a visit in early January of 1867. Catherine, too weak to climb the stairs, sent me to check on Eleanor while she rested in the parlor. I found the girl sitting cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by hundreds of papers covered in the strange markings. The walls of the room were similarly decorated, the symbols arranged in concentric circles and spiraling patterns that seemed to draw the eye inward toward their centers. "What are these, Eleanor?" I asked, picking up one of the papers. She looked up at me, her blue eyes clear and focused for the first time in weeks. "They're words," she said simply. "Words in the true language." "And what language is that?" "The first language. The one that was spoken before the world was made. The one that the others still speak." "The others?" I prompted gently. She tilted her head as though listening to a distant sound. "They've always been here, watching from the spaces between. They speak to those who can hear them. They taught me their words." A chill ran through me at her matter-of-fact tone. "And what do these others want, Eleanor?" Her face remained eerily serene. "To come through. They need a door, you see. Words are doors when spoken correctly. I've been practicing." I changed the subject then, disturbed by the coherence of her delusion. It was one thing to dismiss the ramblings of a child lost in fever dreams. It was quite another to confront a calm, articulate explanation of such troubling thoughts. That evening, I shared my concerns with Catherine. Her reaction surprised me. Rather than the denial or distress I expected, she nodded with grim resignation. "I felt their presence," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "In her room, in this house. Sometimes I think I can almost understand the words she speaks in her sleep. Sometimes I think," she trailed off, staring into the fire. "What do you think, Mrs. Caldwell?" I pressed. "I think they've been waiting for someone like her, someone who could learn their language." She turned to me, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "What do we do, Doctor? How do we save her from them?" I had no answer. The medical texts offered no guidance for such a situation. The more superstitious remedies suggested by the townspeople, salt at the windows, crosses above the doors, seemed equally useless against whatever was afflicting Eleanor. All I could offer was continued observation and the hope that the girl's condition might improve with time. It did not. As January gave way to February, Eleanor's periods of lucidity grew shorter and less frequent. She ate little, slept less, and spoke almost exclusively in the unknown language. The drawings continued to multiply, covering every available surface in her room. When Catherine attempted to remove some of the papers, Eleanor flew into a rage that left both mother and daughter bruised and exhausted. Mr. Caldwell, at his wit's end, consulted with a specialist in mental disorders from Cincinnati, a Dr. Harmon whose methods were considered progressive for the time. After reviewing my notes and examining Eleanor briefly, she remained silent throughout his visit, watching him with weary eyes. He recommended immediate institutionalization. The girl is suffering from acute dementia precox, he declared with the confidence of his profession. The linguistic anomalies are symptomatic of her deteriorating mental state. In my hospital, we have had success with hydrotherapy and controlled isolation in cases such as hers. Catherine wept at the diagnosis. While Mr. Caldwell nodded grimly, plans were made to transport Eleanor to Cincinnati the following week. I voiced my reservations. The asylums of the period were often little more than warehouses for the insane, with treatments that frequently caused more harm than good, but was overruled by Dr. Harmon's authority and the parents' desperation. The night before Eleanor was to be taken away, a violent snowstorm descended on Millbrook. The roads quickly became impassable, and it was clear that the journey to Cincinnati would need to be postponed. Mr. Caldwell, who had been preparing to accompany his daughter to the asylum, found himself stranded in Columbus. Catherine and Eleanor were left alone in the house, attended only by Hannah, the elderly housekeeper who had been with the family since their arrival in Millbrook. What happened that night has been pieced together from Hannah's fragmented account and my own observations upon arriving at the Caldwell home the following morning. The storm had abated by dawn, leaving nearly 2 feet of snow blanketing the town. Concerned about Catherine's health in the extreme cold, I made my way to the Caldwell residence as soon as the roads were passable. No one answered my knock at the front door. Finding it unlocked, I entered, calling out for Catherine. The house was unnaturally cold, with frost patterns forming on the inside of the windows despite the fires that should have been burning in the grates. A peculiar silence hung in the air, broken only by the creaking of the house settling in the winter morning. In the kitchen, I found Hannah huddled in a corner, her grey hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide and unseeing. She did not respond to my questions, merely rocking back and forth, humming tunelessly to herself. It would be days before she could be coaxed into speaking, and even then her account was disjointed and contradictory. I searched the lower floor of the house without finding any sign of Catherine or Eleanor. It was only when I climbed the stairs that I began to hear it, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from Eleanor's room at the end of the hallway. The door was closed but not latched. As I approached, the temperature seemed to drop further, my breath forming clouds in front of my face. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand on the doorknob, seized by a sudden, inexplicable dread. Something in the cadence of the chanting, in the quality of the silence underneath it, warned me against proceeding. Yet my duty as a physician and my concern for Catherine and her daughter compelled me forward. The scene that greeted me upon opening the door defies rational explanation. Even now, as I attempt to record it faithfully, Eleanor stood in the center of the room, which had been cleared of furniture. The hundreds of papers bearing her strange symbols had been arranged in a perfect circle around her. She was speaking rapidly in the unknown language, her voice deeper than should have been possible for a child of her age. Her nightgown, which appeared to have been white originally, was stained with what looked like soot or ash. The walls of the room seemed to undulate subtly, as though the very structure of the house was breathing. The symbols Eleanor had drawn upon them appeared to shift and move when viewed from the corner of the eye, rearranging themselves into new patterns. Most disturbing of all was what I initially took to be a bundle of clothing on the floor near the window. It was only when I stepped further into the room that I recognized Catherine Caldwell's blue dress. She lay curled on her side, her back to me, motionless. "Eleanor," I said, my voice sounding distant and muffled in the strange acoustics of the room. "Eleanor, what has happened? What's wrong with your mother?" The girl turned to face me, and I took an involuntary step backward. Her eyes, once blue, now appeared completely black, without iris or pupil. Her skin was ashen, stretched taut over the bones of her face. When she smiled, her teeth seemed too numerous, too sharp. "Mother has gone to sleep," she said in English, though her voice maintained the unnatural depth I had noticed in her chanting. She was very tired. Everyone is tired at the end. I moved toward Catherine, intending to check for signs of life, but found myself unable to cross the circle of papers. It was as though an invisible barrier had been erected at its perimeter. Eleanor watched me struggle with an expression of detached curiosity. "You cannot help her," she stated matter-of-factly. "She has already begun the journey." She gestured around the room. "As have I. The door is almost open." Can you see them waiting on the other side? I could see nothing beyond the walls of the bedroom, yet I was seized by the absolute certainty that we were being observed, that countless eyes were fixed upon us from some vantage point just beyond my perception. "Eleanor," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "You're unwell. You need help. Please let me take you somewhere safe." She tilted her head, considering me. "Safe," she repeated as though testing the word. "There is no safe place once you've heard the true language. Once you've learned to hear their voices, they find you wherever you go." Her expression softened slightly. "But you needn't worry, Doctor. They don't want you. They want those who can speak to them, those who can open the way." "Who are they, Eleanor?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "The first ones. The watchers. The speakers without mouths." She shrugged, the gesture disconcertingly adult. "They have many names in many languages, but their true name can only be spoken in their own tongue." She opened her mouth as if to demonstrate, but instead of words, a sound emerged that seemed to bypass my ears entirely, vibrating directly inside my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound continued unabated, rising in pitch and intensity until I felt something warm trickling from my nose, blood, I realized distantly. The room around me appeared to warp and bend, the corners stretching impossibly, the ceiling receding into darkness. Through watering eyes, I saw Eleanor raise her arms. The papers surrounding her rose into the air, suspended as though by invisible threads. The symbols upon them began to glow with a faint bluish light. I'm not certain what would have happened next had not fate or providence intervened. A sudden gust of wind, powerful enough to rattle the windows in their frames, swept through the room. The front door must have blown open, creating a draft that surged up the stairs and down the hallway. The suspended papers swirled in the disrupted air, their careful arrangement shattered. Eleanor screamed, a high, childlike sound that cut through the unnatural depth of her previous voice. She lunged for the scattered papers, trying to restore their circle, but the damage was done. The strange tension in the room dissipated abruptly, leaving only the ordinary chill of a poorly heated house in winter. I took advantage of her distraction to rush to Catherine's side. She was alive, barely, her pulse thready and her breathing shallow. Her skin was ice-cold to the touch, her lips tinged with blue. I could find no obvious injuries, yet she appeared to be in a state of profound shock. Eleanor continued to scramble for her papers, her movements becoming increasingly frantic as more of them were blown toward the open window. "No, no, no," she moaned, her voice now that of a frightened child. "They'll be angry. They'll be so angry. I promised them. I promised." Keeping one eye on the girl, I gathered Catherine into my arms and began to back toward the door. Eleanor seemed not to notice, focused entirely on her futile attempt to recover the papers. Many had already been sucked out the window into the snowy morning. In the hallway, I found my legs suddenly weak beneath me. I managed to carry Catherine to the guest bedroom at the opposite end of the hall, where I laid her on the bed and quickly checked her vital signs again. Her condition remained unchanged, but at least she was away from whatever malign influence had filled Eleanor's room. I returned to the hallway, intending to attempt to calm Eleanor and perhaps persuade her to leave the room voluntarily. Before I could reach her door, however, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a high, thin wail that rose steadily in volume until it seemed to fill the entire house. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face contorted in an expression of utter terror. Blood streamed from her nose and ears, spattering the front of her nightgown. "They're coming through anyway," she gasped between screams. "They're coming through me." She doubled over, clutching at her stomach as though in great pain. When she straightened, her movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like a puppet being manipulated by an unskilled hand. Her head twisted at an unnatural angle, and the sound that emerged from her throat was neither human nor animal, a grinding, chittering noise that set my teeth on edge. I wish I could report that I stood my ground, that I attempted to help the child even in the face of these inexplicable horrors. The truth is more humbling. Faced with something that defied all medical and rational explanation, I fled. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the snow-covered yard, not stopping until I reached the road. There, I collided with Reverend Matthews, the town minister, who was making his rounds to check on parishioners after the storm. Seeing my state, disheveled, wild-eyed with Eleanor's blood on my coat, he demanded an explanation. I could give him none that made sense, only that Catherine was gravely ill and Eleanor was not herself. To his credit, the Reverend did not hesitate. Summoning 2 men who were clearing snow nearby, he led the way back to the Caldwell house. By the time we reached it, the unearthly wailing had stopped. The house stood silent and still in the morning light. We found Hannah where I had left her in the kitchen, still unresponsive. Catherine remained unconscious in the guest bedroom, her condition unchanged. Of Eleanor, there was no sign. Her bedroom appeared as though a whirlwind had torn through it. The papers bearing her strange symbols were scattered everywhere, many torn to pieces. The walls, which I had last seen covered in her drawings, were now bare, the wallpaper clean and undisturbed. It was as though the symbols had never existed. Most strange of all was the window. Though it had been closed when I fled the room, it now stood wide open, the curtains billowing in the winter breeze. On the windowsill and the floor beneath it were small, wet footprints, child-sized, leading to the open window but not returning. Outside, the untouched snow stretched to the edge of the wood some 50 yards from the house. There were no footprints, no disturbance of any kind to indicate that someone had jumped or fallen from the second-story window. It was as though Eleanor had simply vanished into the air. The search that followed was extensive but fruitless. The men of Millbrook, whatever their private feelings about the strange Caldwell girl might have been, turned out in force to comb the woods and fields surrounding the house. No trace of Eleanor was ever found. Catherine never regained consciousness. Despite my best efforts and those of Dr. Harmon, who arrived from Cincinnati 3 days later, she slipped away peacefully on the morning of February 12, 1867. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, though Dr. Harmon privately expressed his opinion that she had simply lost the will to live. Mr. Caldwell, upon his return to Millbrook, was a broken man. He sold the house for a fraction of its worth and returned to Boston, taking Hannah with him. I received a letter from him some months later informing me that the old housekeeper had finally begun to speak about that night, though her account was deemed by all who heard it to be the product of a mind unhinged by trauma. She claimed that in the hours before my arrival, Eleanor had begun to speak in multiple voices simultaneously, 11 distinct languages issuing from her mouth in a cacophony of sound. Catherine, attempting to comfort her daughter, had been seized by some invisible force and thrown against the wall. When Hannah tried to intervene, she too was attacked, finding herself pinned to the floor by pressure on her chest so intense she feared her ribs would crack. Eleanor, according to Hannah's account, had then methodically arranged her papers in the circle I later observed. As she completed the pattern, the temperature in the room plummeted, the walls began to ripple, and in their undulating surface, Hannah claimed to have seen faces, innumerable inhuman faces pressing against some thin membrane, straining to break through into our world. They was hungry, Hannah wrote in her barely literate scrawl. I could feel how hungry they was. Not for food. For us. For everything. Mr. Caldwell concluded his letter by informing me that Hannah had been placed in the care of his sister, a kindly woman who lived on a quiet farm outside Boston. He himself was preparing to embark for Europe, where he hoped to find some peace away from the memories that haunted him in America. He thanked me for my efforts on behalf of his wife and daughter and asked that I never attempt to contact him again. I have honored that request until now as I commit this account to paper. Mr. Caldwell passed away in London last year, according to a notice in the Boston papers. Hannah, I presume, is also gone given her advanced age at the time of the events described. I alone remain to tell the story of Eleanor Caldwell, the girl who spoke 11 languages, and perhaps one more that was never meant for human tongues. In the years since, I have devoted considerable time to researching cases similar to Eleanor's. There are more than one might expect, scattered throughout history and across cultures, children with extraordinary linguistic abilities who, upon reaching a certain age, experience severe psychological disturbances. Many disappear under mysterious circumstances. Others live out their lives in institutions, their once remarkable minds reduced to incoherence. I have also studied the symbols Eleanor drew, which I carefully collected from her room after the search was abandoned. Many of the papers were lost or damaged, but enough remained for me to discern patterns. Some of the symbols bear a striking resemblance to writing systems from ancient Sumeria and pre-dynastic Egypt. Others appear in certain obscure mystical texts from medieval Europe. None match exactly, but the similarities are too numerous to be coincidental. A colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, to whom I showed copies of some of the less disturbing drawings, suggested that they represented an attempt to create a perfect language, one that captured the direct relationship between words and the things they represent without the ambiguity and imprecision of conventional human languages. The medieval philosophers called it the Adamic language, he explained. The original tongue spoken in Eden before the fall. They believed that in this language, the word for a thing actually contained the essence of the thing itself. To speak this language was to have power over reality. I did not share with my colleague Hannah's account of the faces pressing through the walls, nor my own experience of the symbols appearing to move and rearrange themselves. Some things are better left undiscussed in academic circles. As for my own beliefs regarding what happened to Eleanor Caldwell, I find myself torn between rational explanation and the evidence of my own senses. The medical literature provides numerous examples of children with extraordinary abilities who succumb to mental illness. The psychological strain of Eleanor's unusual gifts, combined with the isolation imposed by her rural upbringing and the superstitious attitudes of her neighbors, could well have triggered a psychotic break. Yet this explanation fails to account for what I saw and experienced in that room on that February morning. It does not explain the footprints that led to nowhere, the walls that breathed, or the voice that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly within my skull. Sometimes in the depths of winter, when the wind howls against my windows, I imagine I can hear fragments of that voice again, speaking words in a language that predates humanity, calling to something waiting in the spaces between. And I wonder if Eleanor is still out there somewhere, beyond our understanding, speaking those words with her perfect pronunciation, opening doors that were meant to remain closed. I have never married, never had children of my own. After the events in Millbrook, I dedicated myself to my medical practice, focusing particularly on children with unusual mental conditions. I have helped many, failed some, but never encountered another case like Eleanor's. For this, I am profoundly grateful. I set down this account now in my advancing years, not as a scientific document or as evidence of the supernatural, but simply as a record of events as I experienced them. Others may draw their own conclusions. As for me, I have taken certain precautions. The remaining papers bearing Eleanor's symbols are sealed in a lead box, which is to be buried with me upon my death. My will stipulates that my personal journals, including this account, are to remain sealed for 50 years after my passing. Perhaps by then science will have advanced sufficiently to offer explanations for what occurred in that snowbound house in Ohio. Perhaps the boundaries between languages, between worlds, will be better understood and more securely maintained. Or perhaps Eleanor Caldwell will remain what she has been for me these many years, a mystery at the limits of human knowledge, a warning about doors that can be opened but never closed again, and a reminder that some gifts carry terrible costs. I have not set foot in Ohio since 1867. I never will again. But sometimes when I dream, I find myself back in that room, watching Eleanor's papers rise into the air, hearing that sound that was not a sound, feeling the walls of reality grow thin around me. And sometimes, just before I wake, I see Eleanor as she appeared in that final moment, not the hollow-eyed, blood-streaked creature who screamed of things coming through, but the brilliant, curious child she had been. In these dreams, she speaks to me in perfect English, her voice clear and untroubled. "Words are doors, doctor," she says. "Be careful which ones you speak aloud." I have been careful. I have spent a lifetime being careful. But now, as I feel my own end approaching, I leave this record behind. These words, this door open just enough for the truth to slip through. May God forgive me if I have erred in doing so. Thomas Blackwood, M.D.